Hi, everyone. Welcome to the How to Fish podcast by Tailored Tackle. I'm your host, Ed Hitchcock. I'm the owner of Tailored Tackle, and today we are going to be discussing depths. And what I mean by that is how deep in the water are you fishing? Depths can vary from anywhere between 0 feet to 1,500 feet. In reality, we're going to be focusing on freshwater in this episode, so really max depth is going to be 150 feet, and that's going to be a pretty, situational thing. Most of the time we're talking about depths in lakes somewhere between 0 to 75 feet. So we're going to kind of stay in that range right now. We're not doing anything deep sea or anything like that. This is going to be applicable to people fishing onshore just as much as it's going to be for people fishing in a boat. It's going to be easier to achieve these various depths and for different reasons if you do have a boat or a kayak, but if you're fishing off of a dock or a shoreline, this is going to be great for you too. Because of the nature of mobility and getting to different depths in terms of boats and canoes and kayaks, I am ranking this one as an expert. Also, whenever it's like a very specific topic that I'm diving deep into, see the pun, diving deep into depths, it's typically going to be labeled as an expert. Again, all of our episodes, how they're labeled, it's for everybody. You're going to pick up something here. I just might have some terminology and things like that aren't beginner friendly, but it doesn't mean that if you're a beginner, this isn't going to be helpful for you. It's something that's definitely going to be helpful for you down the road, but these concepts of fishing various depths at different times of the year for different species is an important thing to master, especially for finding fish. Now, I also want to say sorry to everybody for not recording over the last couple of weeks. I was blessed with my beautiful baby daughter, Winnie, full name Winifred Hitchcock, and she was born on July 3rd. So for the last, I think we're at 6 weeks now, I have been primarily focused on that. And, we still have to run the Tailored Tackle business. We're growing like crazy, our fishing tackle businesses, and I had to be focusing on customer service and supply chain stuff that's absolutely essential for the business to keep running. So if I only get 3 to 4 hours a day to work, I gotta focus on that. And then this ancillary fun stuff that I love to give all of you guys in terms of education, unfortunately, is not prioritized during intense moments of lack of sleep and work time. So I apologize. We'll get back to getting these out every week now that my baby's a little bit older and sleeping accordingly and feeding accordingly to her age. It's been an awesome journey so far, and I'm really excited to have a new fishing partner for the rest of my life. Anyways, enough about me. Let's get into depth. And let's start with some generalities. So the majority of the time that you're fishing in freshwater, if you're just going out there to catch some fish, you don't really care what you're going to catch. You might throw some live bait out. You might cast a lure. You're just having fun with the family. The majority of your fishing is going to be in 0 to 20 feet of water. And so if you take away anything from this and you're an absolute beginner and you're like, this depth stuff is getting pretty intense, just fish somewhere between, I said 0 to 20, I meant like 5 to 20 feet. Fish somewhere between 5 to 20 feet. You don't want to be at like 0 to 5 most of the time. There's not going to be a lot of fish there. It's too shallow. The oxygen's going to be typically really low. And anything deeper than 20 is typically more specialized for a specific species or tactic. So if you're in that 5 to 20 foot range, I think you can kind of just go for anything with anything, and you'll probably find success. Now, that's not why we're here. I'm not here to tell you, hey, just go fish somewhere between 5 to 20 feet and you'll be fine, because that's not the nature of this episode. The nature of this episode is to really understand depth, why fish go into different depths, and where they're at in a particular time of year. What you're going to notice too when you go and get help at a bait shop is oftentimes somebody will give you a location or they'll give you a depth range. Now, the depth range is really important. It's a huge hint for you, because while somebody's saying, okay, the walleye are biting here on this point, and if that's all they say, then it's like, okay, you go to that point and you don't catch anything and you're like, well, shoot, they're not at this point. Now I've got to scrap this plan and go somewhere else or do something else, and I don't know what I'm doing. But when they say, hey, they're feeding off of the point at 12 feet of water, that's important because that can get duplicated a lot. So if you go to that particular point, you don't know what the fishing pressure's been like. I think fishing pressure makes a huge impact on spots. And so let's say that like he or she that runs the tackle shop has told everybody, go to this point. They're catching them on the point, and you go out there and there's 10 boats and there were 50 boats yesterday, or you go fishing off of the point and from shore and there's like 12 other anglers there. The word's out, and like that pressure can actually affect the amount of fish. And so the conditions could be perfect. The point could be perfect for walleye that day. The depth of 12 feet could be perfect that day. And even if he gives you the depth and the location, you might not catch anything. But 12 feet is like a huge concept, because 12 feet means that like you've narrowed down a huge amount. And like, while a point is a great structural feature, there might only be one point on the lake, or there might be 2 points on the lake. Well, okay, they're holding to structure. There's going to be other structural features. You can try those, but really you're thinking about that depth. At that time of year, the walleye are in this kind of depth range. It could be, if somebody says 12 feet, you should be thinking like 10 to 15 feet. It's not that they're holding to 12 feet and they're only going there. But when somebody gives you a depth range, it's very powerful, because if you know that people are catching fish at that depth, you can find other structural features along the lake within that depth range. And that's going to be a huge help. Now, it's not steadfast. It's not like, oh, this depth, this is where the fish are going to be, and they're going to be there forever, and now I'm just going to duplicate this depth. There's a lot more that goes into it, but it's a big piece of the puzzle. So let's go into why it's a big piece of the puzzle. And I'm going to kind of give you the general spiel of how the majority of fish species move in a freshwater lake. Now, I'll caveat this with not all the fish do this, and some other factors such as feeding and structural features and cover and all sorts of other stuff play a big factor into why fish are in a certain place. But depth is a really big piece of that puzzle, because it determines a lot of those other pieces, right? There's not going to be a lot of weed cover in 30 feet of water, right? And so just something to think about is that, you know, when I'm talking about this, it's not going to be as linear as some of the other podcasts that I've done, where I'm like, okay, step A, step B, step C, and this is how you should think about it. Depth is much more fluid, because it's fluid across a bunch of different species. It's fluid against the different areas, whether you're fishing in a big body of water, a small body of water, a river, a stream, dependent on the fish you're catching. And so because of that, I'm going to try to give you really important general keys to understanding these concepts, but I'm also going to be going fluidly into different species and regions and depths and things like that. And so I apologize that it's going to be confusing, but this topic is confusing. And so I'm going to do everything I can to make it a little bit more simplified, but I am going to take a bunch of different turns. And so try to pull the kernels of generality out of this podcast. And I apologize ahead of time that this is going to get a little wonky, but you know, I don't know, when our team writes a book on all this stuff, which we're working on right now, it'll be much more sequential. Anyways, so back to trying my best to do generalities. Fish in general in a freshwater lake are going to kind of move across different depths at different times of the year because of the other puzzle pieces we're talking about. And one of those big ones is oxygen. The second biggest one is food sources. And then the third biggest one is that cover / structure. Maybe we'll go cover 3, structure 4, because structure really determines the depth. Anyways, so depth is kind of like a good overarching concept that can summarize a lot of these other things. So fish are moving around, and they're moving around for different reasons. So let's start in the... Where's a good place to start? Let's start in springtime. So in springtime, fish are staging. They are typically going to be on the edges. So they're going to be, let's say we've got a big circular pond, and in the deepest section is 50 feet. And then along the shoreline, it goes up to 20 feet, and then it tapers off gradually to 0 on the shoreline, right? So it's like 5, 10, 15, 20, then a steep drop off, and it's just flat out there in 50. Let's think about it that way. During the springtime, fish are staging right at the edge on that like 20-foot area. And then as summer progresses, they'll start to move in and go shallower all the way up to like 5 feet. And then as fall comes, they're typically going to go back to that 20-foot area and stage there. And then in winter, they're going to be in that deeper 50-foot section. Now, like, that's super general, and different species do different things, and they all vary on how deep they're going to go, right? So like, while I said generally stage at 20 in the spring, go up to 5 in the summer, go back to 20 in the fall, and then go to 50 in the winter, that's a totally like, that's more of a sliding scale for how deep that would be. So some fish will be like, okay, 10 foot in the spring, then up to 5 foot in the summer, then back to 10 foot in the fall, and then maybe 15 to 20 foot in the winter. So it doesn't mean that they're going, like, the fish don't all move together. All the species don't move together in this big giant migration. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is like this general concept of staging shallow, staging deep. And that's a good general concept that you should be thinking of in terms of your framework. Now, why do fish do this in general? They do it, I think, number one is because of oxygen. And so oxygen levels in the water fluctuate throughout the year according to the temperature. So when they do for a couple different reasons, but like I would actually think more vegetation wise is a better way to think about it in terms of oxygen. So like the fish in the winter, there is less sunlight. So there are less there's less vegetation in the water, and the vegetation is creating the oxygen. And so if there is less vegetation because there's less sunlight, so there's less photosynthesis to translate the CO2 into oxygen in the water, then there's less oxygen. And so oxygen gets produced wherever there's the most vegetation. And so as the temperatures get colder, the vegetation kind of dies down in the shallower areas and remains like a little bit more deeper, and then oxygen kind of piles up in the deeper section. I don't know exactly what the science is behind that, but just kind of think about it this way. During the hotter months, there's oxygen shallower. During the colder months, there's oxygen deeper, and so the oxygen's moving back and forth, and these fish need oxygen, right? And so that's kind of what's happening. I think the oxygen is the main driver. But the oxygen also goes hand in hand with the food sources. So with vegetation comes plankton, comes small fish eating the plankton, comes bigger fish eating the small fish, and so on and so forth, right? And so when that food source switches and it goes deep to shallow to deep again, in terms of what's left, that's something to consider, right? And then cover as well, right? And so like the cover will happen on the shoreline with docks, and it'll happen like overhanging things like branches with leaves and docks and swimming platforms and boats and stuff will typically be on the shoreline during the warmer months. And then they'll get taken out and the leaves will fall and the docks will get removed or the boats will come in. and the vegetation will die out in the shallower water, and then all of a sudden there's no cover for these fish. So they're moving deeper because of the cover as well. And then structure is just kind of, we're talking about structure in terms of the depth, and so that's just going to help you kind of understand what I'm talking about. So like I said in the beginning of this episode, it's going to get a little confusing and I'm going to ramble a little bit. It's just that I'm condensing a lot of information that I have in my head into what I'm trying to make as bite-sized generalities so that you can conceptualize it when you're out there and you're fishing. So fish are moving. Again, I'm going to keep like reiterating things, not only for myself to keep me on track, but I think repetition's a great way for you guys to learn. So the fish are staging in the spring at 20. They're moving in to 5 to 10 in the summer. They're going back to 20 to stage, and then they're going deeper in the winter. And that's the way that the oxygen is moving, because that's the way that the vegetation is moving, and that's the way that the food source is moving, and that's the reduction of things too. It's not that the cover's moving, it's just that the cover's going away. So this cover was bringing in all of these things, and now it's going away. So then they just kind of go deeper. Now, different species act differently in this depth concept. So the smaller the species, I would say, like generally the less of a movement, and the larger the species, a greater movement. Now, that changes a little bit when you're talking about ice. If you are in the Midwest, Northeast, or upper Western Plains area, ice does put a big factor into this. And so I'll talk about that a little bit towards the end. But like, let's say you're middle of the country, you're in Kansas, right? Typically, the alteration of vegetation and oxygen is to a lesser degree, and so the fish won't move as drastically, but in general, the size of the species will move less drastically. So if you're thinking about panfish, right, back to this example of this pool of 5, 10, 15, 20, big drop off 50 feet, these panfish in general might be moving like this in the summer. They might be like, okay, spring, I'm staging up at 10 to 15. When thick vegetation comes in, I'm going to come into 5. When the thick vegetation starts to go away in the fall, I'm going to go back to 10 to 15. And then in the winter, 10 to 15, maybe 20. And then I'm going to go back to staging again. And so that's kind of how that fish is moving. And then when you were to like step up in size, let's go up to bass. Bass are more sensitive to light. They're more sensitive to oxygen because they're a bigger fish. They require more oxygen. So they're going to be moving a little bit more dramatically. So we're going back to this pond. They might be staging at 15 to 20 in the spring, and then in the summer, they'll move to that 5 to 10 foot area. They'll go back to 20 in the fall, and then they could be anywhere between 20 and 50 in the winter. And so I would think about it that way in terms of kind of size of fish for your general freshwater tactics. Now spawning, I forgot to talk about spawning. I would put that at 5th. Spawning plays a huge key into depth and movement as well. So then before I keep getting more and more complicated, let me just give you some just general guideline rules of what depths to fish, what species during the warmer months of spring to fall. Let's keep it like super broad. So with panfish, during the spring, summer, fall, when you're just fishing, try to fish for them in 5 to 10 feet of water. For bass, try to fish for them in 5 to 15 feet of water. For perch, try to fish for them somewhere between 10 and 20 feet of water. For crappie, I would say 10 to 15 feet of water. For walleye, I would say 15 to 25 feet of water. For pike, 5 to 15 feet of water. For catfish, you're typically going to go You can kind of catch them anywhere, but probably deeper. They're going to be the biggest range. So 5 to 50 feet of water. They're going to be all over the place. Trout are complicated. But you can fish for them inshore and they're stocked and stuff. I would say you're good anywhere between 5 and 30 feet of water for trout. And so that's just kind of like an overview. And after going through those generalities, I think a really good way to cover this topic is to actually go through some of the more popular species that you guys are fishing for and go through kind of like the life cycle, or more accurately, the annual cycle of a specific species, where they're going and why, and how you can capitalize on those things. And I'm going to go over the factors that are driving them. And I forgot to mention this earlier. I should have. It's a huge factor, but spawning. So oxygen, food, spawning, cover, structure. Those are the big ones. That's what's guiding these fish around. And those patterns and those concepts almost always correlate to depth. So let's start with bass, because I think bass is something that everybody kind of mostly has access to, and is definitely one of the more popular species. So let's go over the annual cycle of a bass, where it's going and why. So in the spring, bass are spawning. And when they spawn, that kind of dictates where they're going. And so they are going to stage for spawn. This is why I was talking about staging so much, and I should have brought up the spawn earlier. But they're staging for spawn. So let's kind of we're going to put winter as kind of like November to February. So let's say that like in March is the start of spring and when they're staging to spawn. So they are going to stage in that 15 to 20 foot area, and they are going to feed aggressively. They're going to be mostly feeding on bait fish because that's what's available for them in most situations. And they're going to be staging up. They're fattening up. 15 to 20 feet is kind of where that oxygen level allows those smaller bait fish to school around and get a little bit closer to shore from their winter depths, and bass are going to be feeding on them aggressively. Also crayfish too, because crayfish are going to be around there if they have them in your water body. So they're going to be feeding really aggressively in those mid depths, that 15 to 20 feet. And so that's like around March. So they're staging for spawn, and then they go into spawn. And they're spawning in bays, very shallow areas. And so when you think about it, you can kind of capitalize on the pre-spawn of bass, because that's a really fun time to fish. They're super aggressive. And so if they're staging, that means that they're going to be wanting to feed in that 15 to 20 foot area in close proximity to their spawning grounds. So if you know that they spawn in shallower waters, let's say anywhere between 1 to 5 feet of water in these shallow bays, these shallow inlets, these shallow flats along the shoreline, if that's the case, then you can position yourself at choke points where they're also positioning themselves. So a really great spot to fish for bass in the pre-spawn time, in that early spring, is going to be on the channels and mouths of bays and inlets, because those are typically deeper. They're going to be in that 15 to 20 foot range, and they are going to actually funnel a lot of food there, and they're going to be that perfect kind of station for those bass to sit there and feed up right before they make their 100 to 200 yard journey from that mouth into the bay, let's say. So that's where they're going to be depth-wise. Then as spring starts to progress, they are going to be moving into their spawning grounds. And they are going to kick up these little piles, these little pebble areas. So basically they're taking all of the like leaves and cover that's sitting on the bottom. They are going to move them all away. They're going to make these little disc shape areas of sand and gravel. And sand and gravel hold their eggs better, and then they can see them, they remember where they are, and then they can defend their little spawning areas. And they're also really obvious for their mates to come in and meet up in these little discs and fertilize the eggs. So you'll be able to actually see them. They should be in 1 to 5 feet of water in these shallow bay-like areas. And while I'm not saying I shouldn't condone fishing for spawning bass, because I think ethically it's better for most fish species to let them spawn and reproduce so that you have more bass in your area. Now, the caveat, not the caveat, but like the counter argument to that is this is a great opportunity for shore-based anglers, because a lot of times in this system, like I'm talking about, fish are moving back and forth, especially to deeper water. And while somebody who has a big bass boat and all the tricked out gear and all of that stuff, if you're that guy or gal, I wouldn't recommend going and fishing these spawning beds, because you're going to absolutely slam bass. And while you're catch and releasing, it is damaging to them and their eggs. And so I don't recommend that. And if you're at that stage, you know that you probably shouldn't be doing that. But I personally don't have any ethical quandaries against a family or somebody who's getting started taking advantage of this time of year to fish off of their local dock or, the shoreline of their park, because it's a really great opportunity for them to get access to larger fish and catch and release them. Most people aren't keeping bass and eating them. They're not the premier fish to eat. I'm not saying it's bad to eat bass. You can totally do it. But it's my personal opinion, and most fishing experts, that fish like crappie and panfish and perch, which are also accessible from shore or really anywhere, are better eating and they're easier to catch. So you might as well catch those and fillet them. Anyways, that's a lot of ethical talk. So if you're a hardcore bass angler, please don't demolish the spawning beds by catching hundreds of them during this time of year. But if you're a first-time angler or a family, or you're forced to fish by shore, I personally don't think it's a big deal if you go and catch a couple bass off of their spawning grounds. I'm sure other people are going to be mad that I said that, but I know everybody does it. So whatever. Just be really cautious and be really careful with your releases. Don't drop them on the ground. They're not in their strongest state when they're spawning. Okay. So they're spawning, they're super defensive, they're not eating during this time, but they're aggressively hitting things because they're trying to defend their spawning ground. So if you wanted to fish for them, you could pitch like soft plastics or something like that, where you can really control where the bait is going, and pitch it right on top of the spawning bed. And so it lands somewhere close to that disc, and the fish will hit that very aggressively. If you go out there and you catch a couple, don't push it. I would recommend maybe just 2 or 3 if you're a shore-based angler learning how to bass fish for the first time. I don't have a quandary of you fishing for spawning fish. Just don't catch 50 of them and release them. That's going to do some damage. Just catch a couple, understand how the fish works, and then just kind of respect their spawning area. Anyways, this is getting way too long on spawning. Okay, so post spawn, they are super hungry, and they're in there, and it's spring, and a lot of fish move back out, the bigger ones that came into spawn. So pretty much everything is following this spawning pattern. We'll go over another common fish species that acts differently, like a walleye. We'll go over that next. But everything kind of follows this concept of stage, shallow spawning ground, stage, deeper water relative to their depth preferences. So bass are going to actually stick around that kind of shallower area. They're not going to be all the way up to 5 feet, but they're only going to move to 10 feet, 5 to 10 feet. They're going to be in that area because that's when all of the docks are coming out and the swimming platforms and the boats, and then the vegetation is coming back up. And so that's bringing in all of these food sources. It's bringing in insects. It's bringing in crustaceans. It's bringing in bait fish that are coming to feed on the plankton and sit in the weeds and stuff like that. And so this is a great time for bass to stick around. and they are going to capitalize on all of these food sources that are going to be popping up, as well as these shaded areas. They really like food, they like ambush points, and they like shade. So all of these things are starting to happen at the end of spring and the beginning of summer. So that's what they're going to be doing all summer. Is feeding heavily near shore, which is great. That's why people love bass fishing, is that all summer long there should be a lot of bass action happening in these shallower areas that are accessible off the dock or on a boat. And it's pretty, they're going to be held to that. They're typically not going to be deeper than 15 to 20 feet. It's going to be very rare during the summer for them to do that. So focus on that core area of 5 to 10 feet, maybe 15, depending on the cover and structure, but that's what you're focused on. Okay, then you're moving over to fall. Now, fall they stage, but they don't stage because they're spawning again. They stage because winter is coming and their metabolism is going to slow down. So they need to eat a ton of food in the fall. But the problem is that in the summer, they had all of these resources in 5 to 10 feet of water, and those resources are going away. They might not be totally going away, especially if you're way down south. But there is a movement that happens when it gets colder. It might be more finite. So if you're in Alabama, all of the stuff that I'm talking about is kind of geared towards the Midwest in terms of the depth that I'm referencing, because that's where I grew up and it's just easier for me to think of it that way. But it could be very minute. So all of these movements that I'm talking about for bass, let's say it happens in Alabama, it could be the difference of 5 to 7 to 10 feet instead of 5 to 10 to 15 to 50 feet. It just could be smaller, but the movement still happens. So you got to learn your own water body, but understand these generalities so that you can repurpose what I'm talking about to the body of water that you are fishing. So fall, it's going to get cold. They are going to slow their metabolism down in the winter. And so what they do is they're going to be feeding, kind of in that same area that they were when they were spawning, that 15 to 20 feet area. And this is the time where they're capitalizing on two things. It's going to be bait fish, and it's going to be hatches. Insect hatches happen this time of year. They come up from the mud and they go up to the top, and they're on the surface. And so there are insect hatches that happen in the spring. There's insect hatches that happen in whatever, but a lot of things like mayflies and things like that happen in the fall in most places. So when that happens, I might be wrong on that. I don't know which things. I don't know. I know that there's hatches in the fall because I've fished them. I forget exactly what insect it is. This is why I need to hire a fly fishing person for our inevitable entrance into fly fishing, because they'll know all this stuff. Anyways, fall insect hatches, bait fish, schools of bait fish are schooling up, because that's they were all sitting in that cover and they felt really safe and stuff, and they could be individuals then, but now all that cover went away because it's fall and there's less sunlight, and so the vegetation's going down, so they like to ball up into bigger schools in the fall, and that's what bass are going after. So they're feeding really aggressively, so you get to fish aggressively again. So that's why it's really cool to fish for pre-spawn bass and also fall bass, is because that's typically when they're the most aggressive, and they're feeding really heavily. And this happens for walleye and all sorts of other species. And so, okay, fall, you're going to be fishing aggressively in that kind of 15 to 20 foot range, if we're talking about the pond example that I talked about. And then the winter comes, and winter is always a tough time to fish for bass, because they slow their metabolism down. They fed up a bunch of stuff, and they're basically fighting the colder temperatures and the lower amount of oxygen, and they have to go deeper and deeper to find that oxygen, which is tough. It's tough on their bodies. So they slow down their feeding. They get deeper. You could find them anywhere between 20 feet and 50 feet, honestly. I would say the majority of the time they're going to be in that 20 to 30 feet is like kind of a max depth. But they're going to be really slowly moving around. They're not all going to be bunched up together. They're going to be spread out, and they're just going to kind of hold out through the winter and wait for that springtime pre-spawn to get really aggressive and active again. So that's why they're moving back and forth. And that's kind of the pattern that they're going with. So I know that's a lot to take in. But let's talk about maybe like a different species real quick. I'll give another example and we'll walk through it, and maybe you can pick up some things from there. And then the last one will just be the fish that don't move a lot. The kind of the panfish and the pike. They're not moving a ton. So let's go with walleye real quick, because I think that one's a really interesting one, because I personally, walleye are my favorite freshwater fish. I love talking about them because they're the most complicated, I believe, the most finicky and hard to understand. So walleye movements are similar to the bass. They are going to spawn. They're going to spawn a little bit deeper. They're not going to go 1 to 5 feet. So like, let's move all of these scales back a little bit. So in the spring, walleye are in their pre-spawn. They are going to feed really heavily in the pre-spawn, and they're going to stage. And they're going to be staging at, like, let's say 20 feet of water in our example. Right on the edge of that drop-off, they're going to feed really heavily. And then they are going to spawn in, let's say, 10 to 15 feet of water. And they are also going to look for really like gravelly, rocky areas to spawn, typically, sandy spots. And they are not going to feed at all when they're spawning. You're not going to have that kind of like aggressive bass thing, because you can't even really see their spawning areas. So you wouldn't be able to like pinpoint it. So like if they're spawning, you're not going to be able to get after them. And that's a good thing, because the majority of states don't let you fish for them during their spawn. They have very strict seasons, and so you're typically not fishing for them until post-spawn. Post-spawn ramps up, and they are going to be feeding very heavily. That's when fishing openers typically happen. And so they're sticking around that 10 to 15 foot area, and they like those rocky, gravelly places. They don't like to make it themselves like the bass do. And so typically you're going to find them on those rocky, gravelly, or sandy points, like major keys of structure, where typically that bottom consistency reflects what's on top. And so if you find a big rock pile jutting out into the water, you can pretty much guess that there's going to be more rocks and gravel and stuff underneath the water. And so they're going to be around those areas during the spawn and then after the spawn. And that's kind of like earlier to later spring. And then in the summer, unlike bass, they totally shut down. They really do not like light, and they don't like heat. So they're kind of the reverse, where they're going to go real deep in the summer. You're going to catch them anywhere between, 25 feet of water and 50 feet of water, because they really don't like bright light. They have interesting vision capabilities, where they can see in the dark much better than any other species, but because of that, they're very light sensitive, like way more light sensitive than the majority of species. And so in the summer months, they stay deeper. Now, what's cool about walleye, and why I'm talking about them as a different example, is they have daily depth routines. And most fish don't have this in freshwater. And so they're really deep in the summer. Okay, they're 30 to 50 feet during the hot days, but there's not a lot of food going on in 30 to 50 feet of water. And they still have to eat. So what they do is they stick around and they stay pretty lethargic in these deep areas in the summer. And then at nighttime in the summer, they make this migration from the deep areas into the shallow areas, and they'll feed on the bait fish at night that are in these weed lines and all of these edges. And so that's why, if let's say you're a shore-based angler or a dock angler, I wouldn't fish for walleye during the summer months during the day, but if you go out there with, let's say, a lighted slip bobber and cast out in 10 to 15 feet of water from your dock, you got a good shot at catching walleye if there's walleye in your body of water, because they're doing this pattern where they're staying deep during the day and then coming shallow at night to feed with their night vision. And it's nice and cool. And it's just a better habitat for them. And so they migrate like that. And then they get real feedy, and dusk and dawn, they're very crepuscular is the word for it. Kind of like deer, where they'll feed really heavily in those, like, right before it gets dark and right before it gets light, because it just kind of speeds them up. It's kind of like, hey, this is the time where I'm most hungry. And now I'm going to feed throughout the night. And then, oh no, the sun's coming. I better feed real quick before I have to go back deep and stay lethargic. So those are the summer months. And then in the fall months, the fall is the best time to fish for walleye, in my opinion. So they are plagued with the metabolism issues too, but they're not as much as the bass. That's why they're such an awesome fish to go for in ice fishing, is that they can really withstand a lot of colder temperatures and deeper water, because all summer they were down there deeper in that kind of 30 to 50 foot range. So in fall, it's kind of their time to shine. They still slow their metabolism down in the winter and they're bulking up for that. But like, it's the perfect conditions for them to feed in their happiest place, which I believe is around 20 to 25 feet of water. And they just get to smoke balls of bait fish and the hatches and crustaceans and all sorts of stuff that are happening around that time in 20 to 25 feet of water. Most of the fish, when I fish a really tough body of water, let's say, like, I grew up in the metropolitan area of Minnesota in the Twin Cities, and there are fish in the metro lakes, but there's just not a lot of walleye. They get a lot of pressure. I've had tons of success fishing for walleye in the fall, and even good success in the summer if I'm fishing at midnight or 1 o'clock in the morning. So if that's you, if you have walleye by you, but let's say you live, an hour or two from a metropolitan area, it's probably tougher walleye fishing during the day. You're not up at Lake of the Woods or somewhere on Lake Michigan where you can just, have this huge playground. Those are kind of your times to really capitalize on walleye. And then in the winter, they stick around. They don't really go too deep again. They will, but they stick around in that 15 to 25 feet of water in the wintertime. And that's when you catch a bunch of them ice fishing, because they're one of the few that are going to stay really active during the winter. They're not as active as their spring and fall times, but they're better than their summer times. And they will stay active and feed consistently, even if there's 2 to 3 feet of ice, because they're used to that lack of oxygen and pressure, and colder temps from being deep in the water during the summer months. So I'm sure there's a biologist out there listening to this and you're like, Ed, you've got like 15 things wrong in here. What I'm talking about are all of these things that I have seen through my career of fishing and reading different fishing journals and magazines and books and writing about it and stuff. I don't have a biology background, so I'm just trying to explain to you what I've seen and why I think it's happening. I'm sure that I have errors in here, but who cares? You guys the majority of you aren't biologists. You're not listening to this podcast because you want to know the perfect facts around why this fish has these certain habits. You just want to know where to catch fish, when, and why. And that's what I'm trying to give you. And these are the concepts that have worked for me. Okay, last example. Let's talk about fish that don't move that much. So Panfish and Pike are a great example of this, where they will move, but their range isn't huge. So they're always kind of hand in hand with each other. The panfish are going to be holding to stuff tight around weeds, wherever the weeds end up going throughout the year. And it's not that the weeds go away. It's just that, like, when I'm saying where the weeds are going, I'm saying how predominant they are relative to the rest of the water body. So, in spring, the weeds are going to be flourishing right on the edges, and then they're going to be really flourishing in the summer in the shallows. Those shallow weeds are going to kind of die down, and then the colder water weeds are still going to be there in the middle. not the middle, but like the staging kind of area, and then they're going to die off, and then all that's left is like the old growth weeds that can stick around in the deeper sections. So like that's the kind of way that the weeds work. It's not that they're creeping in and creeping out, it's that different species of weeds can handle and flourish in different environments, and the hotter it is, the better the shallow weeds do. The colder it is, the cold weeds are kind of all that's left. So the panfish and pike move around this because the pike are eating the panfish and the baitfish, and the panfish are sticking to the vegetation because that's where a lot of the plankton is, where a lot of the insects are, and where they can seek shelter and cover from all of these predators that are trying to eat them. So their range is a lot smaller. They all still spawn. They're not as predominant in spawning, like creating spawning beds, as bass are. A lot of them will just spawn on the vegetation. Some of them will make nests. They're kind of all over the place in terms of spawning. Again, another biologist will probably be like, nah, well, this and that and this and that. I haven't been able to observe really predominant spawning beds for panfish or pike. I think a lot of it happens in the weeds. I think it happens in the bottom of the weeds and the top of the weeds. I think it happens all over the place. And that's my personal that's my personal belief. Now, that could be wrong, but whatever. So they're holding to the weeds more consistently. And so we're going to shrink everything down. So in the spring, they are going to be around 10 to 15 feet where there's cold water weeds. They're going to be staging there. They're going to try to feed on the new growth weeds that are coming in, and then they are going to spawn around the same time that everything else is spawning. They're going to come in shallower and spawn kind of really, they're going to hold tight to these weeds. Some of them are going to get really shallow and spawn on the gravel, but I've seen a lot of them just kind of hold to the weeds and spawn there. The bigger the panfish I have seen, the more often I'll see like an actual bed that looks similar to a bass, and then the smaller ones I think are just spawning wherever they can, in threat for their lives. And then the pike too. I think the pike are just spawning in the weeds. And so springtime, pre-spawn, they're going to stage in that kind of 15 to 20 feet of water, just like everything else is, but they're going to hold really tight to the weeds wherever the weeds are. And then they're going to gradually come in as the weeds grow. They're going to stay in those weeds. So like thick summer weeds, the docks, things like that, they're going to be right there. Those panfish are going to be in that kind of like 5 to 10 feet of water. They love holding to docks. They love holding to weeds. And then the pike are just going to always be right outside of them. So wherever the panfish go in depth, the pike will be probably 5 to 10 feet behind them in depth. And that's because they're sitting and waiting on the edges of the weeds and the edges of the docks to get that panfish that just maybe slips out a little too far. So they're going to be staging there. Then both of them are going to be spawning in their own little areas. So I would say that the panfish are going to spawn in 1 to 5 feet of water, maybe 10 if there's thicker weeds there. And then the pike are going to be spawning between 10 and 15 feet of water in the thick weeds. And then they're going to gradually move in closer and closer, and they're going to gradually move back out. And summer doesn't really change their depth too much. They're always going to be somewhere between 1 and 15 feet of depth until the winter comes. So like fall, it's the same thing. They're just kind of gradually moving out. Sorry. I've complicated myself. Okay, spring, 5 feet. Well, so beginning of spring, 10 feet, spawn, middle of spring, 5 feet, summer, stay around 5 feet, fall, back to 10 feet, winter, maybe 15 feet. If you are in an ice location, things get real tricky, and all of those panfish move to the middle of the lake and they stratify in the water column, and they could be anywhere between 5 feet off the bottom to 5 feet below the ice, and you could be finding them in 20 feet or 50 feet. They're all over the place. It has to do with oxygen. Don't worry about that. That's not going to be like the majority of you out there. But again, like the whole concept is that like they're moving in shallow to spawn. They're staying shallow to eat during the summer. They're moving back out a little bit to stage for the winter. And then they're going to be deeper in the winter because of the oxygen and whatever plant life is still available. And then the pike are just going to be following them. So that's the movement. I know, guys, I'm sorry. I've been all over the place with this podcast. I've refuted myself. I've brought it back and forth with different species. I've given different ideas. And I'm sorry about that. This is a complicated topic. It's hard for me to talk about it because there's so much packed in here that I really like to talk about. And there's so many confounding variables that happen with that. But I would say, to kind of summarize, depth is a great way to generalize all of these other things that I'm talking about, right? And so like, yes, I think oxygen levels are important. I think water temp is important. I think spawning is important. I think that cover is important. I also think that structure, which we didn't talk about that much because structure is the depth itself, is important. And I think that the depth summarizes why the fish, or where the fish are, because of these reasons, these other reasons. And so sometimes these other reasons totally outweigh whatever we're talking about in depth. There could be a situation where an insect hatch happens at a certain area and it totally confounds with all of the depth principles we've just talked about. Like, there are a bunch of other factors that are determining where fish are and why, but I think that depth is a great way to like generalize it. And I think that happens a lot when like, I use it a lot when like I'm just randomly, okay, I've got 2 hours of free time after work. I'm going to hit a local watering hole. Where am I going to fish and why? Okay, it is springtime. I want to fish for bass. I'm going to find an area where I can cast into these little spawning areas. And so I might not be fishing off the dock. I might be working the side of the public access, if that's just like, a shoreline. I want to go to the shoreline and fish rather than fishing off the dock, because these bass are spawning in 1 to 5 feet of water and I can cover a bunch more spawning beds working along the shoreline than I would off of the dock. Whereas like, okay, it was winter and I wanted to go fish for bass in the same local spot, I'd go to the end of the dock and cast as far out as I can, because I think that they're going to be deeper, because there's no vegetation left over here in the shallows, or they're not spawning right now. But as a beginner, you don't have to think about all of those things, right? Like you can just go back to this podcast and say, okay, in the summer months, bass are going to be in 5 to 15 feet of water. That's where I'm going to fish for them. Everything's going to be fine. I don't know why that is. I don't know all of these other things. I don't remember them, but I know that bass are going to be in this general depth. And I think that's super important, because that's how I learned how to fish when I was a kid. I'd go to bait shops and they'd give me a depth. That was typically their recommendation, and that helped me zero in on fish when I wasn't catching them. I didn't know why that depth was important, and I hope that this podcast helps you understand why the fish are in a certain depth. But if you can take away anything, it would just be the generalities of depth and the generalities of fish movement that I've discussed in this podcast to help you get on fish. Now, what I've also learned from this recording is that there are a ton of more podcasts that I can do on all of these other things that are contributing to why the fish is at a certain depth, even like why a fish is, where the fish is in the water column at that depth. And so like, we're going to get real granular on all of this stuff. And I've just actually spewed out a bunch of different podcast episodes that I want to do. I want to have a whole podcast on oxygen, on water temps. All of these are different podcasts, vegetation and food and plankton. all these things, these are all deeper dives. But I think that if you know the general pattern of the fish species that you're going after during that time of year, I think you're going to catch more fish. This is what allowed me to catch fish when I was a kid. It was really all that I could comprehend at the time in terms of, the gear that I had and the time that I had to go out and fish. I wasn't capable of like really diving deep into all of this stuff, and it helped me get on fish and get me interested enough to research all of this stuff and build an encyclopedia of why the fish are at this depth. So that's depth. If you guys could go and leave a review, that would be super, super helpful, because then more people will listen to this and I can teach them how to fish. That's really what I want to do. And I think that it's hard to find these resources. I think a lot of these fishing resources are all over the place. I do everything I can with my company to centralize them and give people exactly what they want. With our ebooks and our fishing tackle, it's all based around these concepts of let's condense everything and give them something that's easy to learn and get them to catch fish sooner. And then also after they've done that, give them the resources to dive deeper. So if you can, give us a rating on here and leave us some feedback, it'll help other people find this podcast. And especially if you're getting success from this, I really want to help other people find it. I've looked for information like this when I was learning how to fish, and it was really hard to find it. I had to read different magazine articles and buy a bunch of books and all sorts of stuff. There weren't any podcasts. And so it'd be really helpful for us, to get into other people's phones so that they can hear me babble on about where to go fishing in terms of depth. So thank you so much for listening. Thank you for letting me ramble on this episode. I hope you got a lot out of it. I promise in the future, my episodes will be a little bit more structured, and I'll talk a little bit about more structured concepts. So thanks again.